Spring, 1869.
A northern merchant steps onto the veranda of Harlow Hall, believing he has bought the future. But when his carpenter pries open the walls, hundreds of letters spill out like blood from a fresh wound. Letters that had been praying, counting, waiting.
This is not a house. This is a tomb that finally refused to stay sealed. The lowlands of South Carolina do not forget.
They remember in the way Spanish moss drips like slow tears from live oaks. They remember in the sulphurous breath that rises from the rice fields at dusk. They remember in the way the wind sometimes pauses, as if listening for an answer that never came. Some houses are built on stone. Harlow Hall was built on sin.
And sin, when it is old enough and deep enough, begins to speak.
In March of 1869, the last Hargrove heir signed the deed with a hand that barely trembled. Warren Hargrove, once a Confederate lieutenant, now a hollow-eyed debtor, did not walk the property one final time. He did not pause at the white columns that still gleamed like false teeth in the sun.
He simply mounted his horse, turned north toward Savannah, and never looked back.
The land, 1,600 acres of black tidal muck, cypress swamp, and rice canals dug by hands that had never been paid, passed to Gerald Apprentice, wholesale merchant of Philadelphia, for less than half its pre-war value. Apprentice arrived in early April wearing a crisp linen suit and the confident smile of a man who had supplied boots and blankets to the Union Army and emerged richer for it. He brought with him surveyors, carpenters, and the unshakable belief that money and northern ingenuity could scour the South clean of its past.
He was wrong.
The first man to feel the truth was Daniel Foss, 47 years old, broad-shouldered, a Presbyterian who still read his King James by candlelight every night. Foss had rebuilt mansions in Pittsburgh, repaired churches in Lancaster, and once laid the floorboards of a bank in Harrisburg. He did not scare easily. Yet 3 weeks after he began work on the east wing of Harlow Hall, he walked off the job without collecting his final week's wages. When Apprentice pressed him, Foss only whispered, "There are things behind those walls no Christian man should ever have to see, and once seen, no Christian man can forget."
He would not say more. He simply boarded the next steamer north and was never heard from again in South Carolina.
What Foss had uncovered, and what it would take 4 long years to fully understand, was not plaster and pine. It was evidence. But before we step across that threshold with Apprentice and Foss, you must understand the house they entered.
Harlow Hall did not rise gently from the Carolina earth.
It was forced upward in 1791 by Edmund Hargrove, a man who had arrived in the colonies with nothing but sharp eyes and a hunger that no amount of land could ever fill. The property came to him as partial payment from a fleeing loyalist.
Edmund did not build a home.
He built a monument to his own will. By the time his grandson Nathaniel inherited the estate in 1841, Harlow Hall stood 3 stories tall, white as bone, with wide verandas that caught every breeze and a cupola that watched the fields like the eye of God or something pretending to be him. Fresh whitewash was applied every spring, so obsessively that the paint seemed to be trying to outrun something darker underneath. The plantation ran on rice. Not the dryland rice of the uplands, but tidal rice, the kind that required the knowledge of the West African coast, how to manage the floodgates, when to let the brackish water kiss the seedlings, how to read the moon for the perfect planting hour. That knowledge had crossed the Atlantic in the heads and hearts of men and women who arrived in chains. The Hargroves owned the land.
The enslaved owned the wisdom that made the land pay. Nathaniel Hargrove recorded everything.
Births. Deaths. Pounds of rice harvested.
Number of lashes administered.
He wrote in the same flat, unemotional hand whether he was noting the purchase of a new plow or the sale of a 12-year-old girl downriver. His ledgers were his conscience, or the absence of one. His wife, Dorothea, daughter of a Beaufort rice factor, moved through the house like a ghost in silk. She kept a garden behind the kitchen wing where she grew roses that smelled almost strong enough to cover the scent of the quarters. Neighbors described her as devout and quiet. In Nathaniel's ledgers she appears only as household expense, Mrs. H., New Bible, $4.50. Whatever she saw from the upstairs windows, whatever she overheard in the night, she carried to her grave in 1891 without ever speaking it aloud.
Their son Warren was 23 when Lee surrendered. He had marched with the 1st South Carolina Infantry until malaria sent him home in '63.
For the last 2 years of the war he ran the plantation under blockade, watching the price of rice collapse and the spirit of the people collapse with it. When emancipation came, Warren did what many did, he offered wages so low they were almost insults.
Most walked away.
A handful stayed, old men who remembered Edmund, women who had birthed children on the place, souls who had nowhere else and, in some strange way, still felt the land belonged to them more than to any white man who claimed the deed. By 1868 the fields were choked with weeds.
The outbuildings sagged.
The big house smelled of mildew and something sharper, the slow rot of deferred maintenance and deferred guilt. Warren sold it all in March of 1869 and fled to Savannah, where he died in 1884, still insisting the old ways had been righteous. Gerald Apprentice knew none of this when he stepped off the steamer at the landing. He saw only potential: cheap land, deep water access, a house that could be modernized into a showplace for a northern gentleman with southern ambitions.
He hired local labor and brought Daniel Foss down from Pennsylvania.
The plan was simple: begin in the east wing, strip the damaged plaster, repair the framing, make the house breathe again before the summer fevers arrived. The room Foss attacked first had once been Nathaniel's private study, a small chamber directly above the grand entrance, its southern wall facing the morning sun. The paneling was painted pine over thick plaster. Foss worked methodically, prying the boards away with a crowbar and mallet. The sound of wood giving way echoed through the empty house like small bones breaking. Behind the third panel he found something that was not lath, not insulation, not even old newspapers used for stuffing. The cavity between the exterior brick and the interior wall was packed, floor to ceiling, side to side, with paper.
Not loose. Not scattered. Deliberately compressed.
Folded, rolled, crushed into every crevice as though someone had stood there for hours, sweating, forcing the pages in with the heel of their hand, desperate to make them disappear forever.
Foss pulled the first bundle free.
It came apart in his fingers like wet ash, but the center pages held.
Ink, faded to brown, still legible in places. He saw dates: 1842, 1851, 1859,
1864. He saw names. He saw words no man should have to read in the place he was being paid to repair.
He carried the fragments downstairs to Apprentice that same evening.
The merchant sat at a makeshift table on the veranda, oil lamp flickering against the dark.
Foss laid the papers down without ceremony. Apprentice read 3 of them.
The first was a fragment in elegant female handwriting, Dorothea's, perhaps, describing the necessity of correcting the girl Lucy after she spoke back. The second, in Nathaniel's precise merchant script, tallied value lost by runaways and listed names like inventory. The third, torn diagonally, as if ripped in haste, was written in a hand that shook with every letter, the script of someone who had learned to form words in secret, by candlelight, terrified of discovery. It ended with a single line that would live behind Apprentice's eyes for the rest of his life.
"They do not know we keep count."
Apprentice sat motionless for a long time. The lamp flame trembled though there was no wind. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost reverent.
"I thought I bought a plantation," he said. "I believe I have purchased a grave." He did not run to the sheriff. He did not telegraph Philadelphia for instructions. He simply stared at the papers and felt, for the first time in his prosperous life, the cold certainty that some accounts cannot be settled with money. Because the walls of Harlow Hall had not been hiding shame. They had been hiding testimony. And testimony, once freed, does not ask permission.
It demands judgment.
Daniel Foss would not sleep that night.
He would lie in his cot in the carriage house, staring at the ceiling beams, hearing the house creak and settle as though it were breathing for the first time in decades. He would remember the line from Habakkuk that his mother had taught him as a boy. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the timber will answer it. He understood now, with the clarity that only terror can bring, that the stones had been crying for 30 years. The timbers had been answering. And tonight, for the first time, a living man had finally listened. What those letters contained in full would take years to piece together. Some were written by the enslaved themselves, secret accounts smuggled from hand to hand, copied by the light of stolen candle stubs, hidden because paper itself was contraband. Others were the Hargrove's own correspondence, incriminating replies to factors in Charleston, orders for new whips, calculations of how much profit could be wrung from a pregnant woman before her body broke.
All of them had been intercepted, collected, and sealed inside the walls by someone or someones who believed that one day the God of justice would send a man with a crowbar. That man had come. And the reckoning that began in the spring of 1869 was only just beginning. The house was no longer simply old. It was awake. And it was not finished speaking. The lowlands do not forgive. They remember with the patience of roots pushing through coffin wood. They remember with the slow drip of resin from wounded pines. And in the spring of 1869, Harlow Hall began to confess. Gerald Apprentice had come south believing the war had ended everything. The Confederacy was dust. Slavery was illegal. The future belonged to men with capital and clean hands. Yet the house he had purchased for pennies on the dollar refused to stay quiet. It kept exhaling its sins through every crack he tried to seal. After Daniel Foss walked away, muttering about things no Christian should see, Apprentice made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He did not board up the walls. He did not sell the place at a loss and flee north. Instead, he told the remaining crew, "Keep opening them." Over the next 14 days, the old plantation house surrendered its secrets like a body on the surgeon's table. First came the ground floor kitchen passageway, a narrow, windowless throat between the main hall and the cookhouse. When the plaster came down in dusty sheets, they found a small hollow no wider than a man's shoulders. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, were objects that told stories without words. A brass button, engraved on the back with initials that belonged to No Hargrove, J.M., still bright where it had been protected. A scrap of coarse Osnaburg cloth, the kind field hands wore, stained dark along one edge with something that might have been blood or rust or both. 3 coins, 2 worn American half-dimes and 1 strange foreign piece no one recognized, its edges filed smooth as if it had been passed hand to hand for decades. And a small wooden disc, palm-sized, polished on one side by years of fingers, carved on the other with a spiral pattern that looked almost like the West African Adinkra symbols for endurance under suffering. None of the carpenters could read it. But every man who touched it felt the same chill, as though the disc still carried the heat of the last hand that had hidden it. Next, on the 3rd floor, they discovered a sealed doorway that had been plastered over so perfectly that the wall appeared seamless from both sides. Behind it lay a narrow cavity 4 feet wide, 7 feet long, existing for no structural reason at all. The floorboards inside bore the unmistakable depression of a human body that had lain there many nights. A dark ring on the wood showed where a candle or lantern had burned for hours at a time. And along the inner wall, rising from knee-height to above a tall man's head, were tally marks. Hundreds of them. Neat groups of 5, 4 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal, marching upward like soldiers refusing to break formation. The scratches varied, some deep and angry, some faint and trembling, as though different hands had added to the count over years. Apprentice ran his fingers across them and felt the house breathe against his palm. He later told his attorney it was like touching the pulse of a dying man who still refused to close his eyes. In the overseer's former office at the rear of the house, a built-in cabinet yielded something far more dangerous than objects or tallies. A parallel ledger. Not the official Hargrove books that had come with the deed, those were neat, cold, impersonal. This was different. Handwritten in a careful, educated script that echoed the master's own ledgers but with a soul behind every stroke. Columns of dates. Names the official records had never acknowledged. Quantities. Notations that chilled the blood. The woman brought from the Beaufort auction, her daughter, the child born in October, not recorded. Sold private, buyer from Georgetown, no trace left. Taken at night so the mother would not wake. The entries began around 1848 and continued, steady and relentless, until early 1863. Then the handwriting changed, became slightly larger, less precise, as though the keeper of the record had grown weaker, or older, or had passed the sacred duty to another. But the most haunting discovery waited in the cupola, that small, glass-walled observation room at the very crown of the house, where Nathaniel Hargrove had once stood with his spyglass to watch the rice fields and the people working them like ants. The floorboards there had been pried up and replaced with such precision that only a trained eye would notice the faint seam. Beneath them lay the most deteriorated cache of all. Damp had done its work. Pages stuck together in rotten clumps. Ink bled into ghostly halos. Yet apprentice and Foss spent 2 full days separating, drying, and gently pressing what could be saved between sheets of blotting paper. What emerged was not scattered letters this time. It was a single, continuous narrative written in English that was grammatically perfect, yet somehow not the English of any white Southerner of the period. It was the English of someone who had listened, absorbed, and then weaponized the language of their oppressors. Every sentence carried the quiet defiance of a mind that had refused to stay enslaved even while the body remained in chains. Fragments spoke of moonlit nights when the floodgates were opened just enough to let the tide whisper secrets. Of messages passed in the roots of sweet potatoes. Of children taught to read by tracing letters in the dirt with a stick while pretending to play. Of a woman who sat at the big house desk after midnight, copying the master's accounts by the light of a single candle stub, her heart hammering so loudly she feared the whole plantation could hear it. Apprentice read one intact paragraph aloud on the second evening, his voice cracking in the humid air. "We do not write for the courts of men. We write for the court that never sleeps. Every name they erased from their books, we have written twice, once in ink, once in the memory of God. They do not know we keep count." That same night, Gerald Apprentice sat down and wrote a 7-page letter to his attorney in Philadelphia, Edmund Hartwell. He described everything without exaggeration, yet the words still felt like an accusation against himself for having bought the place at all. Hartwell arrived by steamer 4 days later, a sharp-eyed Quaker lawyer with 20 years of courtroom steel and a historian's hunger for primary sources. The 2 men sat on the veranda until the stars came out, lanterns flickering, while cicadas screamed in the darkness like souls in torment. Hartwell understood immediately what the rest of the country was not yet ready to face in 1869. These documents were not merely historical curiosities. They were legally radioactive. The parallel ledger was the most explosive. It proved, in meticulous detail, a system of deliberate non-registration that had run for 15 years. Children born on Harlow Hall, especially those of mixed heritage or particularly valuable skills, were never entered into the official tax books. Instead, they were sold privately, at night, to buyers who asked no questions and left no receipts. The money flowed straight into Hargrove pockets while the public record remained pristine. This was not common brutality. This was calculated theft of identity itself. Even under the old slave codes, such practices walked a dangerous legal line. Under the new Reconstruction laws and the Freedmen's Bureau mandates, they looked like outright fraud that had robbed hundreds of human beings of any hope of tracing their families after emancipation. But the ledger was more than proof of crime. It was a map. A map of the missing. With the help of fragments from the cupola, Hartwell and Apprentice cracked the simple but brilliant cipher the record keepers had used. A dash after a name meant sold alive, destination noted elsewhere. A small circle meant died on property, 'cause never spoken. A line through the name meant taken without family knowledge, may God have mercy. When the cipher was applied, the ledger transformed from dry columns into a living directory of the lost. Buyers' names. Plantations downriver. Even notes about later resales. This was what "they do not know we keep count" truly meant. Someone, or several someones, inside Harlow Hall had spent more than a decade acting as secret archivists for the souls the Hargroves tried to erase. Hartwell sat in silence for a long time that humid June evening, the ledger open on the table between them, fireflies drifting past like tiny lanterns of the dead. "Someone in this house," he said finally, voice low, "understood that the true crime was not just the chains on the body, but the erasure of the name. They understood that one day, even if it took 100 years, those names would need to be spoken again. They kept the record for the day justice would finally knock." Apprentice leaned forward, the weight of the house pressing down on his shoulders like the hand of God. Who could have done it? Who had that kind of access without being caught? Hartwell had already begun to piece it together. The handwriting changed twice across the 15 years, 3 distinct hands, all careful, all educated beyond what field hands were normally allowed. One of them almost certainly had to be someone inside the big house itself. The official Hargrove ledgers mentioned a woman, Norah, house manager, employed from 1845. Trained in correspondence and accounts. She handled supplies, occasional direct payments, the quiet business of the household that never made it into the formal books. She disappears from every record after February 1863. No death notice. No sale. No mention of manumission. She simply stopped appearing. In the summer of 1869, Hartwell traveled to the overburdened Freedmen's Bureau office in Columbia. The rooms smelled of mildew and desperation. Stacks of paper towered like monuments to unfinished justice. He carried the parallel ledger under his arm and asked for registration records of women who had come through in 1865 and 1866. After 3 days of searching through chaotic files, he found 4 matches. 3 were straightforward women who had registered under names that appeared in the secret ledger, their stories partially reconstructible from bureau notes. But the fourth registration stopped Hartwell's heart. Because the woman who had walked into that office in the summer of 1865, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the memory of 15 years of secret bookkeeping, had signed her name with the same careful, educated hand that had maintained the ledger from 1848 until 1863. She had signed it simply. Norah. No surname. Because the surname had never been hers to claim. And beneath her signature, in the space for remarks, she had written one line in that same defiant script. I kept the count. Now let the walls speak. The house had not merely hidden evidence. It had hidden profits. The Carolina lowlands do not release their dead easily. They hold them in the black silt of the rice canals, in the Spanish moss that hangs like funeral veils, in the way the evening mist rises slow and deliberate, as though carrying prayers that were never allowed to be spoken aloud. By late summer 1869, Harlow Hall had become a living archive of divine accounting. Gerald Apprentice no longer slept in the big house without a lantern burning. The walls, once pried open, now seemed to breathe in rhythm with his own uncertain heart. Every creak of timber at midnight felt like the house itself turning pages in a book only heaven was meant to read. Edmund Hartwell, the Philadelphia lawyer, had come south expecting legal complexity. He left understanding something far older and more terrible. Some records are kept not for courts of earth, but for the court that never adjourns. The 4th registration Hartwell found in the Columbia Freedmen's Bureau changed everything. Her name was listed as Norah Hail. Former location, Rice Plantation, Lowland County, South Carolina, deliberately vague, the way a woman who had spent her life hiding truth would write when freedom finally gave her a pen. Skills, household management, accounting, written correspondence. Age in 1866, 41. Which meant she had been 19 years old in 1845, the exact year the official Hargrove ledger first recorded the arrival of Norah, house manager, trained in correspondence and accounts. No address after registration. No forwarding information. She had taken her papers, thanked the overwhelmed bureau clerk, and vanished into the new world like smoke after a candle is blown out. But the bureau agent had added a marginal note in tight, careful script. Account unusually precise. Gave no names of former owners. Appeared aware of legal implications. She had known exactly what she was doing. She had left the parallel ledger, the cipher, the tallies, the letters, every scrap of testimony sealed inside the walls like seeds planted in consecrated ground. And she had walked away 3 full years before Gerald Apprentice ever set foot on the property. The question that kept Hartwell awake on the steamer back to Charleston was simple, yet terrifying in its implications. Had she hidden the record hoping a man like Apprentice would find it? Or had she hidden it for the day her own people would finally come home? Hartwell spent the next 2 weeks in the Charleston courthouse archives, sleeves rolled up, sweat soaking through his shirt as August heat pressed down like the hand of judgment itself. The room smelled of mildew, old leather, and the faint metallic tang of ink that had dried on lies for decades. He cross-referenced every name from the secret ledger against property transfers, estate inventories, tax rolls, and newspaper notices. Some buyers were ghosts, names that appeared nowhere else, as though they had stepped out of the night at Harlow Hall, paid in gold, and dissolved back into darkness. But others were men of standing. One name appeared 4 times in the ciphered ledger, each transaction involving a child no older than 12. Paid above market. No documentation required. The buyer's name, when Hartwell traced it through county records,
belonged to a former commissioner who, in 1869, sat on the board of a newly formed charitable society dedicated to helping freedmen find honest employment. Hartwell closed the ledger that afternoon and stared at the courthouse wall until the clerk asked if he needed water. He did not. What he needed was air that was not poisoned by the knowledge that the same hands that had once bought children in secret were now publicly praised for their benevolence. He did not storm into any office. He did not write letters to newspapers that would never print them. Reconstruction was already bleeding out in 1869. Federal troops were being pulled back. Night riders in white hoods were learning that terror worked better than law. To expose these men publicly would have been to sign the death warrants of the very families the ledger was meant to help. So Hartwell did something quieter, and in its way, far more dangerous. He created a new document. He titled it, with the dry precision of a man who knew history would one day read every word. A record of certain transactions and their documentation, Harlow Hall, Plantation, South Carolina, 1845 to 1863. Inside, he wove together the parallel ledger, the cipher key, the cupola narrative fragments, the bureau registrations, and his own findings. He wrote by oil lamp long into the night, the scratching of his pen echoing the tally marks on the third floor wall, as though he, too, had joined the invisible company of scribes who refused to let the names die. He made 3 copies. One stayed with him. One went to a trusted colleague in Boston who specialized in novel questions of post-war jurisprudence. The third, along with a carefully worded summary and photographic copies of the most damning pages, he sent to an address in Philadelphia's 7th Ward. The address belonged to Constance Lyle, a woman who ran a small school for black children in a converted storefront. A Prentice had found her name through a quiet contact in the remnants of the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society. The contact had said only, "Tell her exactly what you found. She will understand before you finish speaking." 6 weeks later, a letter arrived at Harlow Hall. It was brief, courteous, signed at the bottom not by Constance Lyle, but in the same educated, slightly slanted hand that had maintained the parallel ledger from 1848 until early 1863. The signature was unmistakable. Norah. Rentice stood on the veranda holding the letter as the sun bled out over the rice fields. The same handwriting that had been compressed behind plaster for decades was now resting in his palm, warm from the afternoon mail. It felt like the house itself had reached out and touched him. He wrote back the same day. One question only. Are the families being found? 3 months later the answer came. Not a letter. A list. 4 pages. 43 names. Some located in Georgia cotton fields. Some in Alabama ironworks. Some still in South Carolina, less than 100 miles from the very canals their mothers had flooded by moonlight. 3 confirmed dead, graves marked only by the cipher's small circle. 11 still missing, but the search continued. At the bottom, in that same hand, one line that felt like both benediction and indictment. This is what they thought they had destroyed. A Prentice folded the list carefully and placed it inside the family Bible his mother had given him the day he left Philadelphia. He spoke of the documents to no one outside the circle of trust for 2 full years. It was not fear for himself, though any reasonable man would have felt it. It was reverence. The papers did not belong to him. They belonged to the hands that had written them by stolen candlelight, to the mothers who had whispered names into the ears of sleeping children so they would not forget, to the God who had promised that the blood of Abel still cried from the ground. And the times were darkening. By 1871, Reconstruction was collapsing like a house whose foundation had been secretly eaten away. Black legislators were being driven from office at gunpoint. Freedmen's schools were burned. The men who had once bought children at Harlow Hall now sat on local boards, wore new suits, and spoke of healing the wounds of war. In October of that year, on a Tuesday afternoon when the live oaks were shedding their leaves like old sins, a man came to Harlow Hall. He arrived without warning. 2 other men waited on the road, hats low, rifles resting easy across their saddles. The visitor introduced himself to Apprentice's housekeeper, Agnes, a local freedwoman who had stayed on after emancipation, as Thane, representative of the Hargrove family interests. He smiled when he said it.
The smile never reached his eyes. Agnes found apprentice in the east wing, where the walls had first been opened. Her voice was flat, careful, the way people speak when they know the house is listening. White man at the door, Mr. Apprentice. Says he come for the papers. Apprentice met Thane on the wide veranda. The man was 50, well-dressed, the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having power and never having been told no. He spoke pleasantly, as though discussing the weather or the price of rice. He had heard, through mutual acquaintances, that certain sensitive family materials had been discovered during renovations. Private correspondence. Old letters. The Hargrove family had a natural interest in keeping such things private. He would be happy to relieve Mr. Apprentice of the burden. A suitable financial arrangement could certainly be reached. Apprentice listened without expression. Then he answered, voice low and steady as the tide coming in. The materials you speak of have already been moved to multiple secure locations outside South Carolina. Copies exist in hands you will never reach. Any attempt to suppress them will ensure they reach 10 times as many. Thane's smile remained perfectly pleasant. But something behind his eyes recalculated the small, cold adjustment of a man who realizes the game has changed. He thanked Apprentice for his time. He walked back to the road. The three men rode away without another word. That night Apprentice wrote to Hartwell and to Constance Lyle before the oil in his lamp ran dry. He did not sleep for many nights afterward. Because Thane's visit had revealed something far more chilling than any threat. The man had known too much, too soon. The details he mentioned, the exact nature of the documents, the timing of their discovery, could not have come from Philadelphia or Boston. The visit had arrived too quickly, with too much precision. Which meant someone had known about the parallel ledger while it was still sealed inside the walls. Someone connected to the Hargrove interests had been aware of Norah's secret archive long before Daniel Foss ever picked up his crowbar. The implications settled over Apprentice like the lowlands mist. Had one of the record keepers been discovered and forced to speak? Had the house itself betrayed its prophets? Or, most haunting of all, had someone inside the big house all along been watching the secret scribes, waiting for the right moment to strike? The walls of Harlow Hall did not answer. But that night, for the first time since the renovation began, Apprentice heard something new. Not creaking timber. Not whined through the cupola. He heard the faint, deliberate sound of a pen scratching on paper, coming from somewhere deep inside the house, as though the final entry in the ledger was still being written. And he understood, with the clarity that only comes when a man stands alone before the evidence of divine patience, that the reckoning begun in 1869 was not nearing its end. It was only now finding its voice. The house had kept the count. Heaven had kept the books. And neither was finished yet. The lowlands of South Carolina do not forget. They remember in the way the tide returns every day to kiss the same scarred banks. They remember in the slow creep of palmetto over old foundations. They remember in the silence that follows a fire, not the silence of absence, but the silence of something waiting to be asked the right question. By 1872, Gerald Apprentice had stopped pretending the house could be made new. The renovations had become half-hearted, interrupted by long periods when no one worked at all. He walked the halls at night sometimes, lantern in hand, listening to the timbers settle as though the building were still deciding whether to forgive him for buying it. Edmund Hartwell, the Philadelphia lawyer, had not come south for absolution. He came for answers. In the spring of that year he traveled to Savannah. Warren Hargrove, once master of Harlow Hall, now a boarder in a narrow room above a livery stable, agreed to meet him. Hartwell had expected refusal. Instead, the door opened on a man who looked 10 years older than his 40-odd years. Warren poured 2 glasses of cheap whiskey without asking. The room smelled of mildew, tobacco, and the faint metallic regret that clings to men who have outlived their illusions. Hartwell asked directly, lawyer's habit. Had Warren known about the ledger? When had he found it? Why had he sold the place to a northern stranger? Warren stared into his glass for so long the silence grew its own weight. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost confessional. January 1866. I was trying to fix the kitchen stove myself, couldn't afford the help anymore. A piece of plaster came away in my hand. I saw the papers behind it. I read enough. I understood what it was. Hartwell pressed, "What did you do?" "Nothing." "Why?" Warren's fingers tightened on the glass. She was already gone. And if I'd told anyone, if the names in there, the buyers, had known I knew, they'd have burned the house down with me inside it. Most likely with the ledger still in the walls. Hartwell asked the final question that had haunted him since Thane's visit. Had Warren chosen a apprentice specifically? For the first time, Warren looked up. His eyes held something between shame and a weary, ancient arithmetic. I made inquiries before I listed it. I asked what kind of man he was. Northern. Practical. No ties here. I needed someone who wouldn't burn the papers the minute he saw them. He had not sold Harlow Hall to escape debt. He had sold it to escape knowledge. He had sold it so the ledger could survive. Not out of sudden virtue. Not out of repentance in the biblical sense. Out of a bone-deep recognition that he was no longer capable of carrying the secret alone, and that destroying it would only prove he had understood its power all alone. Whether that made him a coward or an unwitting instrument of providence, Hartwell never decided. He simply wrote it down. In 1874, Hartwell published a modest volume through a small Boston press. Not a legal indictment. Not a fiery abolitionist tract. A historical monograph titled Hidden Record, The Harlow Hall Documents and the Unregistered Trade in South Carolina, 1845 to 1863. It contained full transcriptions of the parallel ledger, the deciphered notations, summaries of bureau findings, and every traceable buyer. It named the living and the dead without apology. It sold fewer than 300 copies in its first year. 2 Northern papers reviewed it favorably. One abolitionist journal called it a quiet thunderclap. In South Carolina, it was met with perfect silence. The county commissioner who had bought Children Above Market died in 1871, before the book went to print. Whether that was divine timing or mere coincidence depends on whether you believe the Lowlands still keep their own accounts. Gerald Apprentice never realized his vision for Harlow Hall. The house remained half repaired, half haunted. In 1878 he sold it at a small loss to a timber outfit that wanted the acreage, not the ghost. The big white columns stood empty for years. In 1883 a fire of unknown origin swept through, swift, thorough, merciful in its way. Nothing was rebuilt. The earth swallowed the ashes and grew scrub pine over the spot where the cupola once watched the fields. The original parallel ledger passed from Constance Lyle's school in Philadelphia to a historically black college in the South in 1891. The transfer came with a single letter, written in a hand that had grown frail but never lost its precision. Norah Hail, or Norah Hail as she had chosen to name herself in freedom, did not recount her deeds. She did not seek praise. She wrote only, "The record is complete. Every name I could account for has been accounted for. Of the 11 still missing in 1869, 3 remain unknown. That 3 remain is not failure. It is remaining obligation." She signed her name. No date. As though time itself had become irrelevant. The ledger entered the college archives and waited. Decades passed. The world moved on, or pretended to. In the spring of 1924, a young history professor named Elijah Monroe was cataloging uncatalogued boxes in the archive basement. Dust rose in slow columns when he opened one sealed since before the Great War. Inside, the ledger. The cipher key folded inside its cover. Norah's 1891 letter, still crisp where it had been protected. Monroe spent 3 months with the materials, reading by lamplight, cross-referencing, weeping once in the quiet hours when he realized the scale of what had been preserved. In a modest article published that fall in a small journal of American history, he wrote the sentence that would echo through every serious study of clandestine resistance that followed. The most remarkable thing about the Harlow Hall record is not the crimes it documents. It is the evidence it provides of a systematic, sustained, and entirely secret effort by enslaved people to preserve knowledge of their own history under conditions engineered precisely to erase it. These documents were not created for white posterity. They were created for the people they named. They were hidden not to be discovered by strangers, but to be reclaimed by those to whom they belonged. And when that reclamation became impossible in their lifetime, they waited, with the patient, unhurried authority of truth itself, for whoever came next. The walls of Harlow Hall are gone. Fire took them. Timber crews dismantled what remained. The spot where the house stood is now low scrub, palmetto, and silence. No marker. No plaque. Only the slow reclaiming of the earth. But in that southern archive, in a building erected to hold the truth's official records refused, the ledger endures. The ink is faded but legible. The cipher still unlocks every abbreviation. The names are still there, every child sold without record, every mother who whispered their name into the dark so it would not die. They do not know we keep count. They were wrong. The count was kept. The obligation remains. And somewhere, in the way the tide still returns, in the way moss still weeps from the oaks, in the way a single page in an archive can still make a grown man pause and catch his breath, the lowlands remember. Heaven remembers. And the ledger waits for the day when the last three names are spoken aloud. Not as history, but as family.